The hand that gripped her arm was a vice. It was thick, meaty, the knuckles scarred and white. Marcus Thorne squeezed, his thumb digging into the delicate flesh just above her elbow, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and self-satisfaction. "I think you owe me an apology," he sneered, his voice a low growl that was meant for her but loud enough for the whole diner to hear. The diner had fallen silent, absolutely silent. The clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the sizzle of the grill in the back, it all vanished. It was as if the world had taken a sharp, collective intake of breath and was holding it, waiting for the explosion. Alara stood perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. Her gaze was fixed on the greasy spoon resting beside a half-eaten plate on the table in front of him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. But on the outside, she was a statue of calm endurance. This was the moment, the peak of his casual, pointless cruelty. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what promise protected her. And he certainly had no idea that the quiet man in the corner booth, the man who had been watching this entire pathetic performance with eyes as old as stone, had built an empire on the broken bones of men far more dangerous than Marcus Thorne. He had no idea that man had promised Alara's dying father that he would shield her from this exact kind of filth. He was about to find out. To understand the silence that followed, the absolute shift in the gravity of the room, you have to go back. Just 1 hour. The evening had started like any other at the Lamplight Diner. It was a place caught in time, with cracked red vinyl booths, a long formica countertop worn smooth by decades of elbows, and a smell of coffee, frying bacon, and quiet desperation that clung to the air like a fine mist. For Alara, it was a sanctuary. She moved through the narrow aisles with a practiced grace, her steps light, her presence calming. She was a whisper in a world that preferred to shout. Her uniform was crisp, her dark hair pulled back in a simple, neat bun. There was a gentleness about her that seemed almost out of place, a quiet dignity that was often mistaken for weakness. People saw her patience and assumed she was a pushover. They saw her kindness and read it as naivete. They were always wrong. Her kindness was a shield. Her patience was a fortress built over years of surviving a storm he could never imagine. She refilled coffee cups with a steady hand, offered a small, genuine smile to the regulars, and kept the rhythm of the diner flowing smoothly. She knew their orders by heart. Mr. Henderson in booth 3, black coffee and a slice of apple pie warmed. The 2 nurses from the night shift at the nearby hospital, sharing a plate of fries and whispering about their day. And in the far corner booth, the one shrouded, in shadow where the light from the neon sign outside couldn't quite reach, sat Julian. He was there every night, same time, same booth, same order, a cup of black coffee, which he rarely touched, and a glass of water. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and tall even when sitting. He wore simple, dark clothes, a worn leather jacket over a plain gray shirt. His hands were large, resting on the table, and the sleeves of his jacket were pushed up just enough to reveal the faded, intricate lines of tattoos coiling around his forearms. They were symbols she didn't recognize, a language from a life she couldn't comprehend. But his eyes were what held you. They were a pale, piercing gray, and they missed nothing. They were calm, observant, and held a depth of experience that was unsettling. When he looked at you, you felt seen. Not just your presence, but the very architecture of your soul. To Alara, he was just Julian, a quiet, sad man who seemed to like the anonymity of the diner. He was a friend of her father's, a long time ago. That was all she knew. He spoke little, but his presence was a strange comfort, a silent anchor in the corner of her little world. He never made demands. He never complained. He just watched. Then, the bell above the door chimed, a harsh, discordant sound that broke the evening's gentle rhythm. Marcus Thorne walked in. He didn't so much enter the diner as conquer it. He was a man who took up too much space, his swaggering walk a declaration of his own importance. He was dressed in a suit that was a size too tight, straining at the shoulders, making him look like a stuffed sausage of arrogance. A cheap gold watch glinted on his thick wrist. His face was fleshy, perpetually flushed, with small, piggish eyes that scanned the room with a look of bored contempt. He was a former cop, kicked off the force for excessive force complaints, a fact he spun into a story of being too tough for the bleeding hearts. Now he ran a so-called security consulting firm, which was little more than a protection racket, squeezing monthly payments from the small businesses in the neighborhood. The Lamplight's owner, a timid man named Sal, paid him dutifully. That payment, in Marcus's mind, bought him ownership of the place and everyone in it. He slapped his hand on the counter, making the salt shaker jump. "Service!" he barked, though Alara was already walking toward him. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "What can I get for you?" He looked her up and down, a dismissive sneer on his face. "Coffee, black, and make sure it's fresh. Last time I was here it tasted like battery acid." "Of course," she replied, turning to get a fresh pot. The last time he was here, he'd said the same thing. It was part of his routine. From his corner, Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. He watched the exchange without moving a muscle. He saw the way Marcus's gaze lingered on Alara, the predatory assessment. He saw the subtle stiffening in her shoulders, a tension she tried to hide. This was the beginning of the ritual, the testing of boundaries. Alara returned with a steaming mug and placed it carefully on a napkin in front of him. He picked it up, took a loud, performative slurp, and slammed it back down. Coffee sloshed over the rim. "It's burnt," he declared to the room at large. "Can't anyone in this dump make a decent cup of coffee?" A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one met his eyes. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Alara said, her tone perfectly even. "I can make a fresh pot for you if you'd like." "Don't bother," he grumbled, waving a dismissive hand. "Just get me a menu, and try not to take all night." Her composure was a puzzle to him. He expected fear, or at least frustration. He wanted a reaction, a crack in her serene facade that he could exploit. Her unshakable politeness was an insult to his power. It was like punching in water. He spent the next 20 minutes being deliberately difficult. He complained that the menu was sticky. He asked her to list every ingredient in the meatloaf special, then scoffed and ordered a simple cheeseburger. "Well done, not cremated like you people usually do." He sent back his water because the ice cubes were, in his expert opinion, too cloudy. Through it all, Alara was a model of professional grace. She replaced his water with a smile. She took his order with patience. She answered his condescending questions without a hint of irritation. Each act of her quiet competence was another log on the fire of his rage. He wanted to see her break. He needed it. He turned his attention to the other patrons. He made a loud comment about the weight of one of the nurses. He mocked Mr. Henderson's old-fashioned hat. The air in the diner grew thick and heavy with unspoken tension. People ate faster, their eyes downcast, desperate to finish and leave. They were all hostages to this one man's pathetic need for dominance. In the corner, Julian remained motionless. He was a predator in repose. He was watching the jackal play with its food, noting every weakness, every tick, every moment of pathetic bravado. He had seen 1,000 men like Marcus Thorne. They were all the same, loud, brittle, and hollow on the inside. They built their sense of self on the fear of others. Julian knew that the moment that fear was gone, men like Marcus simply ceased to exist. They collapsed in on themselves like a dying star. Alara brought Marcus his cheeseburger. She placed it before him carefully. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked. He stared at the plate for a long moment, searching for a new flaw. Finding none, he picked up the burger and took a huge, messy bite. He chewed with his mouth open, a deliberate act of vulgarity. Then, he looked straight at her, and with a small, almost imperceptible movement, he tilted his coffee mug. Hot, black coffee poured onto his lap, splashing onto the floor. He leaped to his feet with a roar of feigned outrage. "Look what you did!" he shouted, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at her. "You clumsy idiot! This is a $2,000 suit!" The accusation was so absurd, so blatantly false, that a gasp rippled through the diner. Everyone had seen him do it. Alara stood frozen for a second, the sheer injustice of it washing over her. I didn't," she started to say. "Don't lie to me," he bellowed. "You bumped the table. Now look at this mess. It's all over my shoes." He thrust his foot forward, displaying a pair of garishly polished loafers, now splattered with coffee. "Clean it up," he commanded. The words hung in the air, vile and heavy. Alara stared at him, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to walk away, to tell this monster to go to hell. But she thought of Sal, the diner's owner, who was already struggling. She thought of the paycheck she desperately needed. She thought of the quiet life she had fought so hard to build. Surviving was sometimes about swallowing poison with a smile. She took a deep breath, her face a mask of neutrality. "Of course," she whispered. She retrieved a cloth from behind the counter and knelt down in front of him. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot spike in her gut. She could feel the eyes of every person in the diner on her, a mixture of pity and shame. Their shame for not intervening, her shame for kneeling. As she reached for his shoe, he shifted his weight. His foot jerked forward, a supposed accident, and caught her on the shoulder. It wasn't a hard kick, not enough to cause real injury, but it was enough to knock her off balance. She fell sideways, catching herself with one hand on the grimy floor. That was it. The final straw. The ultimate degradation. Slowly, she pushed herself back up, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a cold fire he had not seen before. She stood up, the damp cloth still clutched in her hand. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with newfound steel. Marcus laughed. A loud, ugly sound. "Or what?" he taunted, stepping toward her, invading her space. "You'll spill something else on me?" He reached out and grabbed her arm. And that is when the world stopped. That is when the silence fell. And that is when, from the darkest corner of the diner, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound was not loud. It was a soft, deliberate rasp of wood on linoleum. But in the dead silence of the room, it was a thunderclap. Every head turned. Julian rose from his booth. He unfolded himself slowly, deliberately, like a man with all the time in the world. He was taller than anyone had realized, his frame broader, more imposing. The cheap lighting of the diner seemed to shrink away from him, deepening the shadows that clung to his worn leather jacket. He placed a few crumpled bills on the table to cover his untouched coffee, his movements economical and precise. Then, he turned his head, and his pale gray eyes fell upon Marcus Thorne. It was not a look of anger. It was not a look of aggression. It was a look of absolute, soul-chilling finality. It was the look a geologist gives a rock before he brings the hammer down. A look of pure, dispassionate assessment just before an act of irreversible change. The air in the room changed. It was a physical shift, as if the barometric pressure had plummeted. The stale, greasy air suddenly felt thin and cold. The fear that Marcus had so carefully cultivated, the fear that had been directed at Alara, suddenly lost its anchor. It detached from her and, like iron filings to a magnet, it swiveled and locked onto a new target. Marcus felt it as a cold prickle on the back of his neck. He was still holding Alara's arm, but his grip had slackened. He looked at Julian, a flicker of confusion in his piggy eyes. He saw just an old man in a leather jacket. A nobody. "Got a problem, Grandpa?" Marcus sneered, trying to recapture his blustering dominance. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. There was a tremor in it now, a tiny crack in the foundation of his arrogance. Old Man Hemlock, the cook, peeked his head out from the kitchen window. His face, usually ruddy and cheerful, was as white as a sheet. His eyes were wide with a terror that was rooted in memory. He recognized Julian. He knew the stories. He knew the name they used to whisper in the dark alleys of the city. The architect. Julian took a single, slow step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words cut through the silence, calm and absolute. "Let her go." 3 simple words. But they landed with the force of a physical blow. They carried a weight, an authority, that Marcus had never encountered before. This was not the timid pleading of a victim or the blustering challenge of a rival. This was a statement of fact. A command that was not open to negotiation. To understand the weight of those 3 words, You have to understand who Julian was. You have to understand the life he had buried. 20 years ago, Julian wasn't a quiet man drinking coffee in a rundown diner. He was Julian Thorne, no relation to the sniveling creature in the diner, a bitter cosmic irony but known to the city's underbelly by a single, chilling moniker: the Architect. He did not rule his criminal syndicate like a thug. He ran it like a nation. It was an organization built not on fear, but on a complex and unshakable system of loyalty, debt, and mutual respect. He was a master strategist, a visionary of the underworld. His operations were intricate, precise, and almost always invisible to the law. He wasn't a gangster. He was a CEO of a shadow empire. His code was simple and absolute. You do not harm children. You do not betray the family. And you protect your own, always. His people were not his employees. They were his responsibility. He was known for his quiet generosity to those under his protection and his terrifying, methodical retribution against those who crossed him. Violence, for Julian, was never an act of passion. It was a tool, a scalpel to be used with surgical precision, only when absolutely necessary to remove a cancer from his organization. He found loud, brutish men like Marcus Thorne to be distasteful. They were amateurs. Their cruelty was clumsy, their power illusory. True power, Julian knew, was control. Control of yourself. Control of the situation. Control of the outcome. He had it all: wealth, power, respect, fear. And he had a daughter. Her name was Lily. She was the sun in his dark world. She had his gray eyes but her mother's gentle smile. She was everything good and pure that he was not. For her, he was trying to get out. He had been slowly, carefully dismantling his own empire, trying to transition into a legitimate life, a peaceful life. He was almost there. But the underworld does not allow for peaceful retirements. A rival, a brutish upstart who mistook Julian's methodical withdrawal for weakness, decided to make a move. They didn't come for him in a boardroom. They didn't challenge his operations. They came for him at his home. It was a storm of bullets and shattered glass. Julian fought back with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Alongside him was his most trusted friend, his right hand, a man named Michael. Michael was Ilara's father. Michael was a scholar, not a soldier, but his loyalty to Julian was absolute. He had been with him from the beginning, the quiet strategist who helped the architect draw his blueprints. They held them off, but not before a single, stray bullet found its way through a window and into Lily's room. She was only 10 years old. The empire Julian had built turned to ash in his mouth. The power, the money, the fear he commanded it was all meaningless in the face of that terrible silence from his daughter's room. Michael died in his arms on the lawn, shielding Julian from a final, desperate volley of gunfire. His last words were not of fear, but a whispered plea. "My Ilara, promise me, Julian. A quiet life. Protect her." Julian made the promise. In the week that followed, the architect returned for one last terrible piece of work. He did not just defeat his rivals. He erased them. Their organization, their families, their very names were systematically dismantled and wiped from the city's memory. It was not a war. It was an extinction event, carried out with the cold, silent precision for which he was famous. When it was over, Julian Thorne vanished. The architect became a ghost story, a legend whispered by old men. He used his vast, hidden resources to set up a new life. He gave most of it away. He created a trust for Ilara, ensuring she would never want for anything, though she never knew the source. He found this small, forgotten corner of the city and settled into a life of quiet penance. He watched over Ilara from a distance, honoring his promise to Michael. He saw her grow up, saw the same gentle strength in her that her father had possessed. He chose the Lamplight Diner as his nightly vigil because it was her space, her sanctuary. Being there, a silent guardian in the corner, was the only thing that gave his hollow life a flicker of purpose. He was not living. He was standing watch. And now this pathetic, ignorant bully had stumbled into his vigil. He had laid his filthy hands on the last remnant of Julian's honor. He had threatened the one promise Julian had left to keep, and for that, there would be a reckoning. Back in the diner, Marcus Thorne stared at Julian, the gears of his small mind grinding. "Let her go," Julian repeated. The words were no louder, but they seemed to vibrate in the very air. Marcus laughed, a high, nervous sound that fooled no one. "Make me," he challenged. Julian's expression did not change. He simply started walking toward them. His steps were unhurried, measured. Each footfall on the worn linoleum was a drumbeat, marking the end of Marcus Thorne's world. Marcus was bigger than Julian, younger, heavier. By all appearances, he was the stronger man. But as Julian drew closer, Marcus felt an instinctual, primal fear begin to bloom in his chest. It was the fear of the sheep that has just realized it is not alone in the pasture with the wolf. He wasn't looking at an old man. He was looking at something ancient and dangerous that was wearing an old man's skin. His grip on Alara's arm, the source of all his power moments before, now felt like an anchor chaining him to his doom. He wanted to let go, to run, but his pride, his stupid, fragile pride, wouldn't allow it. Julian stopped a few feet away. He ignored Marcus completely. His gaze was on Alara. "Are you all right, Alara?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with a genuine concern that was a stark contrast to his terrifying presence. She nodded, her eyes wide. She was seeing a side of her father's quiet friend that she never knew existed. Julian's eyes flicked to Marcus's hand, still clamped on her arm. "I will not ask you a third time," he said, his voice dropping back to that flat, chilling tone. Sweat beaded on Marcus's forehead. His bravado was crumbling, flaking away to reveal the terrified bully underneath. He let go of Alara's arm as if it were red-hot iron. He shoved her away slightly, a final, petty act of defiance. "Fine, take the tramp." Julian's hand moved. It was not fast. It was a blur of controlled motion. He didn't strike Marcus. He simply reached out and placed his hand flat on Marcus's chest. There was no push, no shove. But Marcus felt as if a slab of granite had been pressed against his sternum. All the air was forced from his lungs in a silent whoosh. He stumbled backward, his legs tangling, and crashed into a table. Plates and cutlery clattered to the floor. The sound was deafening in the charged silence. Marcus lay there, gasping for breath, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Julian hadn't even looked at him. His focus was entirely on Alara. He gently took her arm, the one Marcus had been gripping, and turned it over, examining the red marks his fingers had left behind. A flicker of something truly dangerous crossed Julian's face then. It was a brief, terrible storm that passed as quickly as it came. He looked up from her arm and his eyes finally, truly, settled on the wheezing man on the floor. "What is your name?" Julian asked. The question was not a pleasantry. It was an indictment. "None of your damn business," Marcus wheezed, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. "Your name," Julian repeated, "is Marcus Thorne. You were a police officer for 6 years, dishonorably discharged after 3 separate internal affairs, investigations into assault and evidence tampering. You now run a company called Thorne Security, a consulting firm with exactly 1 employee, you. Your business model consists of intimidating small business owners into paying you a monthly fee in exchange for you not vandalizing their property. Sal, the owner of this diner, pays you $300 a month. Last week, you collected from the bakery down the street. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, was short $50. You accidentally knocked over a tray of her cooling pastries on your way out." Julian paused. Each fact was delivered in a calm, level monotone, as if he were reading a grocery list. The color drained from Marcus's face. He was looking at Julian now, not with confusion, but with pure, unadulterated terror. "How? How do you know that?" he stammered. "It is my business to know things," Julian said simply. He then turned his attention to the rest of the diner, his voice carrying to every corner. "I would like to ask a question of the people here tonight," he announced. "This man claims the young lady was clumsy and spilled his coffee. Did anyone see what happened?" For a moment there was only silence. The patrons were still caught between their old fear of Marcus and their new, more profound fear of Julian. Then, a voice piped up from booth 3. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly regular. I saw it, he said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. He did it himself. He tipped the cup, deliberately. Another voice, one of the nurses. He did. We both saw it. He's been bullying her all night. One by one they spoke. The dam of fear had broken. A flood of testimony filled the room, each person recounting a specific insult, a specific act of cruelty Marcus had committed that evening. They were no longer a collection of frightened individuals. They were a chorus. They were witnesses. Julian listened to it all, his face impassive. He was not conducting an investigation. He was holding a trial. When they were finished, he looked back down at the pathetic man on the floor. You built your world on the belief that you are strong and they are weak, Julian said, his voice a low murmur. You enjoy making people feel small, because you live in constant, gnawing fear of your own insignificance. Your power is an illusion, propped up by the silence of good people who are afraid to speak up. He took a step closer. But the silence is broken now, Marcus. Your world is over. Marcus scrambled backward, crab, walking on the floor until his back hit the wall. Who are you? He whispered, his voice cracking. I am a man who is keeping a promise, Julian said. He then turned to Alara. His entire demeanor softened. The chilling authority vanished, replaced by a quiet gentleness. Alara, he hurt you. He humiliated you. Justice is not about what I want. It's about what is right. So I ask you, what do you want to happen to him? The entire diner held its breath. All eyes were on her. The quiet waitress. The victim. But she wasn't a victim anymore. Julian's actions had not saved her. They had validated her. They had given her a platform to stand on. Her own quiet endurance, her refusal to break, was the foundation. He had simply built the walls around it. She looked at Marcus, cowering on the floor, a bloated caricature of a man. She felt no hatred. She felt no desire for violent revenge. She felt only a profound, weary pity. She looked at her hands, then at the diner, her sanctuary that he had violated. She thought of Mrs. Gable's pastries smashed on the floor. She thought of Sal, paying money he couldn't spare out of fear. She finally looked at Julian, and he saw the strength of her father in her eyes. I don't want him hurt, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the diner. Violence is his language. I won't speak it. A murmur of respect went through the room. I want him to learn, she continued. I want him to understand what it's like. To serve. To be invisible. To have your dignity depend on the whims of a stranger. I want him to understand what real work is. Julian nodded slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. It was the answer he had hoped for. It was the answer Michael would have been proud of. He turned his gaze back to Marcus. You heard the lady, he said. You have been sentenced. Your punishment is to learn. Marcus stared, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? You're insane. For the next month, Julian stated, you will work here, in this diner. You will arrive at 6 a.m. and you will leave when Alara says you are finished. You will wash every dish. You will mop every floor. You will clean the grease trap. You will be paid nothing. Your teacher and your supervisor will be Alara. You will address her as ma'am. You will learn her job. You will learn respect. You will learn humility. Marcus burst out laughing, a hysterical, broken sound. You're crazy. I'm not doing that. You can't make me. The bell above the diner door chimed softly. 2 men stepped inside. They were nothing like Marcus. They were dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits, their movements silent and fluid. They were calm, professional, and radiated an aura of lethal competence. They were Julian's lieutenants from the old days, Leo and Cassian, men who had answered his call without hesitation after years of silence. They had been waiting patiently in a car across the street. They flanked the entrance, their presence sealing the room. Julian looked at Marcus with something akin to pity. You misunderstand, he said quietly. This was not a request. This is your new life. If you perform your duties to Alara's satisfaction for 30 days, you will be allowed to leave this city and never return. If you refuse, or if you fail, well, Leo and Cassian will explain the alternative to you. I assure you, it is far less pleasant. It involves a long boat ride from which you will not return. The color drained completely from Marcus's face. This was real. This was happening. Furthermore, Julian continued, his voice dropping even lower, every single dollar you have extorted from the businesses in this district will be returned. Tomorrow morning, with a 50% interest penalty, as an apology. The funds will be transferred from your various accounts, which my associates are in the process of accessing right now. You will be left with nothing. Your car is being towed as we speak. The lease on your apartment will be terminated in the morning. Everything you thought you owned is gone. Your slate has been wiped clean. This is day 1 of your education. Leo and Cassian moved forward. They did not rush. They moved with the unhurried confidence of men who have never met a situation they couldn't handle. They each took one of Marcus's arms and lifted him to his light feet as if he weighed nothing. "Wait," Marcus croaked, his eyes wide with panic. "Please, your education begins in the morning," Julian said, turning his back on him, the ultimate dismissal. "Leo will bring you your uniform. I suggest you get some sleep." The two men escorted the now limp, whimpering Marcus Thorne out of the diner and into the night. The door chimed shut behind them, and the spell was broken. The diner erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. People started talking at once, the tension bleeding out of the room like air from a punctured tire. Mr. Henderson walked over and patted Ilara's shoulder. "You were very brave, my dear," he said, his old eyes shining. The nurses came over to hug her. Other patrons offered words of support and admiration. Old Man Hemlock emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He walked straight to Julian. "I always knew who you were, architect," he said in a low voice, for Julian's ears only. "I worked in a kitchen in your territory 25 years ago. You were a hard man, but you were fair. You kept us safe." Julian just nodded, accepting the words. Hemlock then raised his voice, addressing the whole diner. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," he said, his voice booming with the authority of his years. "We sat here in silence. We let that scum bully this young woman because we were afraid, and our silence gave him his power. Tonight, one man spoke up, and then another, and his power vanished. Don't ever forget that. True strength isn't in a bully's fist. It's in a kind person's heart, and it's in the courage of a community that stands together." He looked at Ilara with deep affection. "And it's in the spine of this young lady right here, who stood her ground with nothing but her own dignity." The patrons applauded, a warm, genuine sound that filled the small diner. After everyone had settled down and the business of the evening slowly resumed, a new, lighter atmosphere settling over the room, Julian walked over to Ilara. She was standing by the counter, still processing everything that had happened. "Your father would have been proud of you tonight," he said softly. Tears finally welled in her eyes. Not tears of fear or humiliation, but tears of relief and gratitude. I didn't know, Julian," she whispered. "About you. About any of it. It was better that you didn't," he said. "That life is over. I made a promise to your father to ensure you had a quiet life, a safe one. I'm sorry that my past had to intrude on it tonight." "You didn't intrude," she said, looking him in the eye. You kept your promise." He gave a rare, small smile. He deserved a lesson, not a beating. Cruelty is a disease born from weakness. You can't cure it with more weakness. You cure it by forcing it to look at strength, the strength you showed, the decency of the people in this room. That is what defeats men like him. Not fear, not violence. Empathy is a far sharper blade. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "The diner is safe now. The whole neighborhood is. The word will spread. No one will bother you again." And with that, he turned and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had lived in its corner. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. The next morning, as promised, Leo delivered a pale and trembling Marcus Thorne to the diner's back door. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt, ill-fitting black pants, and an apron. Ilara met him at the door. "Your station is the dish pit," she said, her voice even and professional. "The morning rush dishes are piling up. Mr. Hemlock will show you how to work the sanitizer." Marcus just stared at her, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Whatever Leo and Cassian had explained to him the night before had been thoroughly convincing. He mumbled, "Yes, ma'am," and shuffled past her into the kitchen. For 30 days, Marcus worked. He scrubbed pots crusted with burnt cheese until his hands were raw. He mopped up spills, cleaned bathrooms, and hauled heavy bags of trash to the dumpster in the alley. He was clumsy, sullen, and miserable, but he worked. Alara was a fair supervisor. She was demanding but not cruel. She corrected his mistakes patiently. She never raised her voice. She treated him with the same professional courtesy she showed everyone. And that, for Marcus, was the most profound punishment of all. Her refusal to stoop to his level, her unshakable dignity, was a constant, glaring spotlight on his own wretchedness. He saw the diner from the other side. He saw the kindness of the regulars. He saw how hard Alara and Hemlock worked for very little money. He heard the stories of the people he had once terrorized the nurses, talking about losing a patient. Mr. Henderson talking about his late wife. He was forced to exist inside the world he had only ever tried to dominate. He was learning their language. One afternoon, during a quiet lull, he saw Alara drop a tray of glasses. They shattered on the floor. Without thinking, he rushed over with a broom and dustpan. "I've got it, ma'am," he said, kneeling down to sweep up the shards. She looked at him, surprised. "Thank you, Marcus," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his name without a tone of instruction. In that moment, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt, for the first time in a long time, useful. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. The neighborhood changed, too. Word of what happened at the lamplight spread like wildfire. The story became a local legend. The quiet man in the corner became a folk hero. Business owners who had lived in fear of Marcus suddenly walked with their heads held high. The money he had extorted was returned to them, as promised, deposited anonymously into their bank accounts. The Lamplight Diner became more than just a place to eat. It became a symbol of the community's newfound strength. It was busier than ever, filled with people who wanted to be a part of the story, to support the brave waitress and her mysterious protector. Alara blossomed. The quiet sadness in her eyes was replaced by a confident light. She smiled more, laughed with the customers. She was still gentle, still kind, but now everyone knew that her kindness was not weakness. It was the core of her strength. On the 30th day, Marcus finished his final shift. The floors were mopped, the last dish was dried and put away. He stood before Alara, his apron in his hands. He looked thinner, humbled. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "My month is up," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," she replied. She handed him an envelope. Inside was a one-way bus ticket to a city 1,000 miles away and a few $100 in cash. "A severance package," she said, "for a job well done." He stared at the envelope, then at her. He expected a final lecture, a parting shot of contempt, but there was none. "Thank you," he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. He turned to leave, but then he stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding foreign and clumsy on his tongue. "For everything." Alara nodded once. "Go and be a better man, Marcus." He walked out the back door and she never saw him again. Later that night, long after closing, Julian was sitting in his usual booth. The diner was dark and quiet. Alara sat across from him, sipping a cup of tea. "He's gone," she said. "I know," Julian replied. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Keep my promise," he said, his gray eyes soft in the dim light. "I'll be here, watching." "You don't have to," she said. "I'm not afraid anymore." "I know. You're not," he said. "But a promise is a promise, and your father was my friend. Besides," he added, a hint of a smile on his face, "Hemlock has started saving me a slice of the cherry pie. It would be a shame to miss that." Alara smiled, a real radiant smile that lit up the dark diner. Her sanctuary was safe. Her life was her own. She had faced down the monster and had not become one herself. She had learned that true power wasn't about making others kneel. It was about having the strength to help them stand up. And in the quiet corner of a city that had forgotten his name, The architect, the keeper of a final, sacred promise, sat his vigil, content that the world he was guarding was finally at peace.